Okay. In this section, we're going to look at the idea of consumer surplus. And to start, we need to first take a look at our supply and demand graph. Okay. So let me go ahead and draw a supply and demand graph, and then I'll talk about how we're going to look at it a little differently than we did before. Okay. So we have our demand curve. And before we were looking at this, what we call horizontally. So we were saying, okay, suppose we have some price like this one. Okay, I've got some price here. How much do people want to buy at that price? Okay, and that's the way we're interpreting this. We're looking horizontally and we say, well, okay, if you have a price, let's say you have a price of like $50, well, how much will people want to buy? How much would the market want to buy at $50? And now we're going to do kind of a vertical interpretation. So this vertical interpretation is going to be about willingness to pay for a specific unit, for a specific unit. Okay, so for example, let's suppose we go to the fifth unit. So we go here, this is the fifth one. Okay, and we go to this one and we say, well, if we look at it vertically, then this demand curve tells us, well, how much is somebody willing to pay for this unit? So what we're saying is, well, we're going all the way up here at 5. I'm going to make this one wide. You'll see in a second why I'm doing this. We go to this point. At this, well, you can just think of it as this height, right? And suppose this is $100. Okay. So what does that tell us? Well, it means for this fifth unit, they're willing to pay $100, right? So that's what the demand curve tells us. So for this particular unit, the person who buys it, they're willing to pay up to $100. Okay. So let's write that down. Okay, so they're willing to pay up to $100 for the fifth unit. Okay, and we also could say that, well, this willingness to pay, how it determines how willing you are to pay. Well, if we assume people are rational, then this willingness to pay is also going to be related to the perceived benefit that the consumer gets. Okay, so this means the consumer perceives that this unit, this fifth unit, is going to bring them $100 of benefit. Okay, so the perceived benefit of just the fifth unit, because if the benefit was greater than $100, well, the person would be willing to pay more. And if the benefit's a lot less than $100, it would be irrational to be willing to pay this much. Okay, and so we call this something. We can say, well, the marginal benefit of just the fifth one is 100. Okay, so now let's go to another unit. Let's say like we go to the 40th unit. Okay, so now for this one, the willingness to pay is much lower. So I don't know what this is. Let's just make up a number. Let's suppose this is $30. Okay, so they're only willing to pay $30 for the 40th unit, right? So the demand curve arranges these willingness to pay in order from the person who's willing to pay the most down to the persons who's willing to pay the least. Okay, so and we can also then say here the marginal benefit to the person who buys it, the perceived marginal benefit of this 40th unit is just $30. Okay, so we are adding two things to what we did before. First thing we're adding is this willingness to pay idea. And the second thing we're adding is then connecting this to the marginal benefit. So often you'll see the demand curve is also labeled as a marginal benefit curve. And it's a willingness to pay and a marginal benefit curve. Okay, so before we move on to another video, let's add one more thing to this. Okay, so I'm going to draw the same graph as before. So this would be the same graph as before. I'm now labeling this as marginal benefit. And now we're asking ourselves a question, well, okay, before we were talking about marginal benefit, like just sell one. And now we're saying, well, let's suppose we sell 40, right? So what's the total benefit going to be? So that's just going to be, we want to talk about the total benefit for consuming. Let's suppose these are free, right? We'll give them to the 40 people who like it the most for consuming 40 units. Okay, so for example, well, we're going to have the benefit of like the first person, and we have the second person and the third person, right? They're all getting some benefit. And eventually, and then we got all the way, this 40th person gets some benefit, right? And so if we add all these up, eventually it's just going to be this whole area, right? So we can say here, well, the area under D, under the demand curve, up to Q equals 40 represents the total benefit. So each height represents the benefit that one person receives for that particular unit. And then if we get this whole thing, it represents the total benefit for this amount of 40. So anyways, so what we established here is the height represents, sorry about that. What we established here is that the height represents the benefit for consuming a particular unit, which we call the marginal benefit of that unit. And we've also then represented, if we want to find the total benefit for consuming a certain amount, then we can just add up each of these marginal benefits, and we end up with this total benefit here. Okay, let's take a little break, and then in the next video, we'll come back and put this together to get us the concept of consumer surplus.